The sharp crack of a gavel echoed through the courtroom. Let's get this started. Judge Arthur Dalton, without so much as a glance at the case file or waiting for the attorneys to present their arguments, sat ramrod straight. His piercing gaze swept across the courtroom before he declared in a monotone, "The court has reviewed the matter. The defendant is in violation of Local Ordinance 14B. A fine of $10,000 is to be imposed immediately." No one had time to react. No arguments, no examination of evidence, no explanations. Everything happened too fast, too abruptly. Pam Bondi raised an eyebrow slightly, her mind already racing. This wasn't a typical hearing. It was a power play. She took a deep breath and slowly rose to her feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun the proceedings." Dalton folded his arms, his eyes still cold. Arguments are irrelevant. The room fell silent. Everyone understood. Pam had just stepped into a battle she hadn't anticipated. Before we delve into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story tailor-made for you. Usually, continuances were granted, and proceedings followed a predictable pattern. Yet, when Pam Bondi found herself abruptly facing a fine, her reaction cast a shadow of doubt on Judge Dalton's impartiality, even in his own eyes. Pam had never expected the day to unfold as it did. Courtroom 3B, nestled within a Tampa courthouse, was supposed to be a mere stopover in her schedule, a routine hearing. She had graced these halls countless times, facing judges of varying temperaments. But nothing about this day had hinted at the extraordinary. She sat at her desk, expression composed, reviewing her notes. Across from her, the city attorney adjusted his tie, fidgeting in his seat as they awaited the judge's entrance. The case was a minor dispute, or so it seemed, one that shouldn't have lasted more than 10 minutes. But the moment Judge Arthur Dalton stepped into the room, Pam sensed an undercurrent of unease. Dalton commanded the room without uttering a word. Tall, adorned in his black robes, and with piercing eyes, he exuded an undeniable aura of authority. Ordinarily, judges would dedicate a moment to perusing the case file, exchanging nods with the attorneys, and settling into their seats before making any pronouncements. But not Dalton. "Let's get this started," he declared, his tone abrupt. Pam straightened slightly, detecting the shift in demeanor. "The court has reviewed the matter," Dalton continued, "and upon consideration of the arguments, I find the defendant in violation of Local Ordinance 14B and hereby impose a fine of $10,000, payable immediately." Silence descended. Pam's eyebrows arched almost imperceptibly, her mind already analyzing the situation. She had anticipated a discussion, a debate, perhaps even a warning, but this was a summary judgment delivered without preamble. The city attorney glanced at her, almost apologetically. Even he was taken aback by the swiftness of the proceedings. Pam steadied herself, her voice measured. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun the proceedings. I haven't had the opportunity to present my arguments." Dalton barely blinked. Arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is explicit. He paused, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was thick with silence. She wasn't one to lose her composure, but there was something about this maneuver that felt deliberate. This wasn't a judgment, it was a statement. She studied Dalton, analyzing him. There was something in his eyes, a confidence that transcended mere judicial authority. He wasn't just ruling on emotion, he was putting her in her place. Pam's voice remained steady, yet resolute. "If the law were as clear-cut as you suggest, Your Honor, we wouldn't be here. I request the opportunity to present my case." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had anticipated her reaction. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "By all means, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you, the outcome will be the same." That's when she knew it wasn't just about the motion, it was about her. Pam rearranged the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity. The fine itself wasn't the issue. She had fought bigger battles. It was the principle that she couldn't ignore. She looked directly into Dalton's eyes. "Then I suggest we begin." The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably. The court reporter, who had been typing diligently, paused, adjusting her posture. Even some of the spectators in the back leaned forward, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Pam glanced at the legal brief in front of her one last time, though she hardly needed it. She knew what she was going to do. Dalton thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to realize this wouldn't be as easy as he assumed. But before anyone could speak again, Pam raised a hand, a signal that she wasn't finished. And what followed left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Pam let the silence linger, allowing it to amplify the impact. She didn't rush, didn't falter. She simply shuffled through her files, again, more for dramatic effect than anything else, before finally looking up at Judge Dalton. "Your Honor," she began, her voice even and unwavering. "Before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something." Her tone was level, devoid of emotion. "Are you suggesting that a party has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" Dalton's expression remained unchanged. "I'm stating that the violation is clear and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then she nodded. "Interesting." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." Pam leaned back slightly, maintaining her calm demeanor. "It's just that I've been practicing law for quite some time, and in all those years, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a plea before hearing any arguments on it. It's, what's the phrase, unprecedented." Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just stalling. She was setting the stage, forcing him to respond. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and law clerks awaiting their own cases, were now fully engaged. Some exchanged glances. Even the court bailiff, a man who had likely witnessed 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted slightly in his seat. Dalton exhaled slowly. "Ms. Bondi, this court is not a theater for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, present it. Otherwise, the fine stands, and we'll move on." Pam offered a subtle, knowing smile. That was it. He had opened the door. She rearranged her papers once more, but this time she didn't look down. She looked directly at the judge. "Very well, let's talk about Local Ordinance 14B, which you claim I violated." She tapped her finger on the document in front of her. "You stated the law is clear, but that's precisely the interesting part, because I happen to know that this very ordinance has been challenged multiple times in the past 5 years, with varying interpretations." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "The language and the subclauses, let's take, for example." Pam continued, her voice flowing smoothly, almost conversational, "are so vague that it has been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate jurisdictions. And let's not forget that just last year, a judicial ruling from the Clearwater Appellate Court concluded that imposing fines under this statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections." The courtroom was utterly silent. Pam could sense the shift in the room's dynamic. The judge knew it too. Dalton stiffened, his tone sharper. "Those precedents are not applicable here." Pam didn't miss a beat. "Not applicable." She flipped to another page. "Because from my vantage point, it appears they are. The language of the ruling in Reynolds versus Clearwater is quite clear. The very act of imposing a fine without evidentiary consideration was deemed to be reversible on procedural grounds." She let those words sink in before adding, "And surely the court wouldn't want to disregard precedent." Dalton shifted in his seat. Pam let that hang in the air for just a moment before delivering her next blow. "Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established legal principles, in which case, I'd be more than willing to take that up." Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. "Are you attempting to build an appeal on a procedural technicality, Ms. Bondi?" Pam emitted a short, mirthless laugh. "Your Honor, I'm not making threats. I'm citing the law." A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle, yet significant. She had shifted the dynamic, forcing the judge to defend his position rather than simply issue rulings unchallenged. Dalton knew it too. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton raised a hand, cutting him off. His eyes remained locked on Pam. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "Very well, you may present your case." Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was merely the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Dalton made it clear that he wouldn't make this easy. Judge Dalton didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "Proceed," he said, his voice carrying more of a warning than an invitation. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about law anymore. It was about control. He wanted to ensure she understood her place in his courtroom, but she wasn't one to be intimidated. She adjusted her posture, maintaining an unreadable expression. "Let's start with the language of the ordinance itself," she began, tapping her papers. Local Ordinance 14B states that any entity failing to comply with city regulations may be fined. Simple enough. But the problem lies in the definition of noncompliance. The language is too broad, too vague, and inconsistent with established constitutional due process protections. Dalton nodded slowly, unimpressed. "And yet, Ms. Bondi, this ordinance has been enforced numerous times without issue." Pam tilted her head. "Interesting, because according to public records, at least 4 prior enforcements have resulted in partial or full reversals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out." She gestured towards the city attorney, then looked back at Dalton. "Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient." Dalton's grip on the desk tightened slightly. "Ms. Bondi, if your argument hinges on nebulous procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written." Pam allowed a beat of silence before responding. "Except when it's not." A rustle of whispers came from the back of the room. Pam retrieved another document and continued. "Let's talk about Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. The defendant in that case was fined under this very ordinance, the same wording, the same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's handling of the matter violated state-level due process protections." She paused for emphasis. "Does the court recall what the judge said in that ruling? That the statute as applied does not provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unconstitutionally vague." Dalton's expression remained blank, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The city attorney leaned forward. "Your Honor, I believe we're straying from the point." Pam turned to him, cutting him off before he could continue. "Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile that ruling with the fine your office is attempting to enforce today. If you have any legal basis to distinguish Henderson, please enlighten us." The attorney hesitated. His silence spoke volumes. Pam turned back to Dalton. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has determined that this ordinance is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it?" Dalton leaned back, his eyes sweeping over her, calculating. Pam knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, trying to find an angle where he could regain control. Finally, he spoke. "The facts of that case are not identical to yours." Pam didn't even blink. "True, but the ordinance was applied identically. The law is either clear or it's not." Silence hung in the air. The dynamic in the room had shifted. Pam knew she had cornered the judge, not because he was legally wrong, though he was, but because she had forced him into a position where any decision he made would now be scrutinized. He could double down, ignore precedent, and risk having his ruling overturned, or he could back down, which would mean admitting he had acted prematurely. Pam didn't envy his position, but he had put himself there. Dalton exhaled slowly. "Ms. Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable." Pam smiled faintly. "Then let's debate it." The judge's nostrils flared slightly, and then, surprisingly, he reached for his gavel. "This court will recess for 15 minutes. He stood before anyone could object, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. Pam laid her papers down, her expression calm, but inside, she knew what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to concede, but he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time to think, to strategize, perhaps even to look up the cases she had cited. That meant she had backed him into a corner. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone, and what happened next would escalate this battle to a whole new level. 10 minutes passed like an hour. Pam remained seated at the counsel table, her hands resting lightly on the stack of papers before her. She wasn't reading them. She didn't need to. The legal precedents, the procedural arguments, the statutes she had cited, all were etched into her mind. She was prepared, but something about Judge Dalton's abrupt recess left her uneasy. He wasn't one to procrastinate, which meant he was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't anticipated. The chamber door opened, and Dalton re-entered, flanked by someone new. A second judge, whom Pam recognized immediately, Judge Richard Whitaker, a senior jurist, higher in rank than Dalton. The moment Whitaker stepped in, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. This was no longer standard procedure. Introducing another judge mid-hearing was not only unusual but calculated. Pam adjusted her stance, keeping her expression unreadable. Dalton sat down, his voice level. "Before we continue, I've asked Judge Whitaker to join us on this matter." Asked? Pam didn't miss a beat. Someone had pulled strings. Whitaker nodded slowly, his presence calm yet authoritative. Ms. Bondi, I understand you've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Ordinance 14B. Pam met his gaze directly. That's correct. Whitaker interlaced his fingers. You believe this fine is being levied without due process? She didn't hesitate. I don't believe it. I know it. A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. I appreciate your confidence, Ms. Bondi, but let's be specific. You cited Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a subsequent ruling clarified that certain applications of the ordinance are indeed permissible under local jurisdictional authority? Pam kept her expression neutral, but internally, she felt the shift. So that was it. Dalton had retreated, brought in higher authority, and now they were attempting to counter her argument with an obscure technicality. Pam folded her hands. I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor. But I'm also aware that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must include substantive evidentiary standards, which in this case were not met. Whitaker nodded, as if he expected her to say that. Then let's address that. The enforcement officer who issued the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam barely suppressed a smile. She hadn't expected that, but she welcomed it. She turned her head as a man rose from the back of the room. Officer Thomas Calloway, a city enforcement officer. He was middle-aged, dressed in a crisp Navy uniform, and carried the confident demeanor of someone used to justifying his decisions. Pam kept her voice level. Yes, Your Honor, I would. Dalton gestured for Calloway to come forward. The officer approached the witness stand, was sworn in, and sat down. Pam rose, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam settled into the seat on the side of the jury box, where there was no jury, but where they were watching. And on what basis did you determine that a violation had occurred? Calloway sighed, as if the answer were obvious. The ordinance is clear. Any vendor without proper city permits is in violation. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? He hesitated. No, ma'am. It wasn't necessary. She offered a small, almost amused smile. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Calloway bristled slightly. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I don't need photos to ascertain what I see. Pam's expression remained calm, but inside, she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back towards the judges. I appreciate your confidence, Ms. Bondi, but let's be specific. You cited Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a subsequent ruling clarified that certain applications of the ordinance are indeed permissible under local jurisdictional authority? Pam kept her expression neutral, but internally, she felt the shift. So that was it. Dalton had retreated, brought in higher authority, and now they were attempting to counter her argument with an obscure technicality. Pam folded her hands. I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor, but I'm also aware that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must include substantive evidentiary standards, which in this case were not met. Whitaker nodded, as if he expected her to say that. Then let's address that. The enforcement officer who issued the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam barely suppressed a smile. She hadn't expected that, but she welcomed it. She turned her head as a man rose from the back of the room. Officer Thomas Calloway, a city enforcement officer. He was middle-aged, dressed in a crisp Navy uniform, and carried the confident demeanor of someone used to justifying his decisions. Pam kept her voice level. Yes, Your Honor, I would. Dalton gestured for Calloway to come forward. The officer approached the witness stand, was sworn in, and sat down. Pam rose, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam settled into the seat on the side of the jury box, where there was no jury, but where they were watching. And on what basis did you determine that a violation had occurred? Calloway sighed, as if the answer were obvious. The ordinance is clear. Any vendor without proper city permits is in violation. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? He hesitated. No, ma'am. It wasn't necessary. She offered a small, almost amused smile. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Calloway bristled slightly. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I don't need photos to ascertain what I see. Pam's expression remained calm, but inside, she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back towards the judges. Could you please read back the last statement? The court reporter, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes, barely hesitated before repeating, "The fine stands." Pam turned back to Dalton. "Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, you're stating on record that a city fine can be levied without evidence, in direct contravention of established due process." Dalton's fingers drummed on the desk. "Ms. Bondi, this court has the discretion to rule as it sees fit." Pam's lips curled into a subtle, knowing smile. "Indeed, but discretion is not an exemption from legal standards." The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly seeing where this was headed. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the judges. "Let's be clear. If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any law enforcement officer can issue a fine based solely on their word. No proof, no documentation, just an assertion." Dalton's silence told her all she needed to know. She turned towards the gallery, her eyes sweeping over the lawyers, clerks, and onlookers who had gathered for the hearing. Imagine the implications. A business owner fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner penalized for something they can't even verify. And if they contest it, too bad. The law has discretion. Several heads nodded discreetly. Pam turned back to Dalton. "That's not discretion, Your Honor. That's unchecked authority." The force of her words filled the room. Whitaker finally spoke. "Are you arguing that allowing this fine to stand without evidence would undermine due process?" Pam nodded. "Not just due process, but judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertions instead of evidence, the entire legal system begins to erode." Dalton's grip on the desk tightened. He knew he was cornered. The city attorney finally interjected. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton raised a hand, cutting him off. His face was unreadable, but Pam could see the frustration in his eyes. There was no way to win this, not for him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dalton exhaled. "This court finds that the fine imposed does not meet the evidentiary threshold required for this action." His voice was clipped, almost reluctant. "The fine is reversed." A wave of hushed murmurs swept through the courtroom. Pam nodded slowly, politely. No triumph, no gloating, just quiet resolve. Dalton banged his gavel. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she headed for the exit, she heard Dalton's voice one last time. "Ms. Bondi." She turned back. Dalton's eyes met hers. "I underestimated you." Pam offered a small smile. "You wouldn't be the first." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking on the polished marble floor. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain. This case wouldn't be forgotten. It had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond these courtroom walls. And somewhere in another courtroom, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. Pam walked down the marble hallway, her steps steady, her mind sharp. The implications of what had just happened were not lost on her. She had entered the courtroom expecting a routine hearing. What she got was a battle of wills, law, and ego, and she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget moments like these. They didn't appreciate being outmaneuvered, especially not in front of a packed courtroom. As she approached the courthouse exit, a voice called from behind her. "Miss Bondi." She paused, turning to see Judge Whitaker approaching, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't one for pleasantries, so if he had stopped her now, it wasn't just for a casual exchange. Pam inclined her head. "Is there something I can do for you, Judge Whitaker?" Whitaker studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're good." Pam smiled faintly. "I try to be." He nodded, glancing back towards the courtroom doors, before lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "I wasn't brought in to observe, Miss Bondi. I was brought in to rein you in." Pam raised an eyebrow. "Rein me in exactly?" Whitaker paused, his eyes sweeping over her. Judge Dalton doesn't like to lose. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example. Pam had already surmised as much, but hearing it confirmed only made the victory sweeter. She kept her voice level. "What happens now?" Whitaker hesitated, then looked at her with a mixture of respect and warning. There will be eyes on you. And not just here. Pam understood exactly what he meant. Today, she had done more than win a case. She had challenged the system, and that wouldn't go unnoticed. She nodded once. I appreciate the warning. Whitaker gave her one last look before heading back towards the courtroom. Pam turned towards the exit, pushing open the heavy courthouse doors and stepping into the bright afternoon sunlight. The air felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first time she had fought a battle in these halls, nor would it be the last. But there was a lesson in today's fight, one she hoped others would find. Power wasn't about who sat behind the judge's bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. It was about knowing the rules well enough to bend them. It was about standing firm when others expected you to back down, and most importantly, it was about never assuming that just because someone handed you a ruling, you had to accept it. Pam Bondi had walked into that courtroom expecting a routine hearing. She walked out having reminded everyone, especially those in power, that the law wasn't just about enforcement. It was about understanding. It was about challenging, and today she had done just that. What do you think of Pam Bondi's decision? If you were in her position, would you be willing to stand up for justice even if you knew you would face challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could be an inspiration to many. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of perseverance and justice. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories. Wishing you strength and success on your journey. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individuals or organizations. They are shared for the purpose of promoting humanistic values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.